Welcome back to another opening guide. I am extra excited for this one here because we're talking about the Prins Sicilian. This is a variation that I myself have been using recently and it's worked quite well. A lot of players are not prepared for this, so let's not waste any time. Let's jump straight in. You can see the timestamps on your screen right now and also in the chapters in the timeline, so if you want to jump around, feel free, but the plan for the video is just going to be the following. We're going to give an overview of what the Prins Sicilian is and sort of the philosophy behind employing the system, and then we're going to look at some of the theory, some example games, some of the basic ideas to get you started. Okay, so the Prins Sicilian, as the name suggests, is a variation that white can choose to play against the Sicilian defense, so e4, c5, knight f3, and the Prins is against the move d6. Now, black has many other options. They can play g6 here, they can play e6, knight c6, a6, and with all of the variations that they have, except for knight c6, we can actually get very similar positions. So one of the beautiful things about the Prins is that it's not only accounting for d6, but you can transpose very often and get very similar structures against e6 and a6 and g6 and so on. Again, everything aside from knight c6. I'll talk about this more later in the video. Once you already have a feel for the Prins Sicilian, I'll explain a little bit how you can use what you just learned and apply it to some of the other Sicilians that you might face, and then you'll get kind of a bigger picture for how to use these concepts against the Sicilian as a whole. So hold that thought. Let's jump into the actual Prins Sicilian to understand what it is. So d6, this is sort of the traditional Prins. We're playing d4. They're going to take, and we're not going for the open Sicilian, though it kind of seems like it right now, because we're not playing knight c3, which allows the Najdorf and the dragon. No, we're going to sidestep all of that theory, and we're playing f3 in this position. Okay, so what is the philosophy behind f3? What are we hoping to achieve? Well, the entire idea of f3 is that we are trying to defend the e4 pawn, which is currently under threat, but we're trying to do so with a piece other than the b1 knight, because we are trying to avoid developing and moving this knight to c3 because we want to play the pawn to c4 first. The entire philosophy of the Prins Sicilian is establishing the Marozzi bind. The idea here is that when we get a pawn on c4, we're going to have such dominant central control and primarily light square central control that it will allow us to have a lot of space and a very easy game following that. So c4 is going to be our next move now that this pawn is defended against pretty much anything that black can throw at you. So if they're a Najdorf player, maybe they'll play a6, we're playing c4. If they're a dragon player against g6, c4. If they're playing e6, you guessed it, we're playing c4. Knight c6, we're playing c4 as well, and we're establishing the Marozzi bind. So if black doesn't challenge us immediately after the move f3, we're going to play c4, and I would already consider that as a slight win. So I'm going to explore what happens in those lines where black doesn't challenge us immediately, but just to give you kind of a picture of the best response for black, they have to challenge us. They have to notice that, okay, this pawn is weakening the king quite a lot. It's also not developing a piece, so it's slow, and we're going to try to punish that with the move e5. Okay, so I'm essentially for this video going to group the options that black has into two buckets. Either they play e5, they challenge us immediately, they play the best move, and they go for it, or they play, a6 or g6 or e6 or, any of these moves here, which together actually account for more games than e5, especially at lower levels. A lot of players don't know the theory here, and you can't easily play e5 without knowing the theory that follows, because you can easily get hurt quite quickly. So one of the benefits of the Prins is that a lot of times you're going to get a very easy game if they play something like a6. So let's start by looking at this bucket. So they don't challenge us with e5. We already consider this a small win. We play c4. We establish the Marozzi bind. Okay, now what? Now, as white, our job is very easy, right? We're going to develop naturally. The knight comes to c3, the bishops to e3 and e2. The e2 bishop is important to keep here because we want to play queen d2 and maintain this open d file that we can sort of pressure the pawn here, because a lot of times they play e6 in fact, and this pawn becomes weak on d6. So again, knight c3, bishop e3, bishop e2, castles, queen d2, bring the rooks to the d and the c file. Those are essentially the next 6 or so moves that we're playing automatic. Now, as black, things are quite difficult in these structures when they don't play for e5, and that is because they're restricted greatly in terms of space. They kind of have to maneuver along the first three ranks. They can never break with d5. That's one of the benefits of the Marozzi bind. And what you'll see is that they end up playing very passively with e6. And then they end up, having to play b6 to develop the bishop to b7. And it's a very passive setup. But nonetheless, they get their pieces out, and there's still a game that we need to continue playing. So what do we do from here? Okay, well, let's play queen d2. Like I said, this is where the queen wants to be. And now what? Well, one thing that I'll quickly mention is that the knight typically comes to d7, but I want to show why it should not come to c6. A lot of the times, if the knight is on c6, that actually makes our rook c1 move, which we're playing anyways, a lot stronger. So let's see why. Because the queen comes to c7, they have to connect their rooks, and then the queen often comes to b8. But if they don't play queen b8 fast enough, we're quick to take and play something like knight d5. This comes in a lot of different positions when there's a piece on c6, which is why they often should not develop the knight to c6. And the idea, of course, is after takes, we are going to be winning not only the bishop, but we're also taking some interest. I believe this pawn here is falling in many of these lines, something like this, and the entire queen side is collapsing very quickly. So this knight d5 jump is something to be aware of. If they move their queen, of course, we are happy to simply take the dark squares. We have the two bishops, and in fact here we're just winning the d6 pawn. Like I said, this is one of the key weaknesses to keep in mind. So it's very difficult. I mean, the best move here for them is to take with the bishop, and they're surviving here. We're not winning a piece or a pawn immediately, but okay, we have the open bishops, we have the c file, we have pressure along the d file. We're clearly in better shape here. And so this knight d5 jump, keep this in mind. It's often a very powerful resource that we have at our disposal. Now, aside from this knight to d5 jump, let's say they develop better with knight to d7, what is white playing for here? Well, one option, if you want to be very aggressive, is f4, f5. This is risky, it's double-edged, it's possible if nothing else is working for you on the queen side, you can always throw this pawn at your opponent, and a lot of the times, the extra center that you have will support this kingside expansion. But a lot of times more effective, and importantly far less risky, are simply adding pressure on the queen side, playing on this side of the board. So let's look at what this can look like. White can already play b4 here, and we're playing on the queen side. The idea is to, okay, support some queenside expansion, and later, after king h1, just an extra safety move. We're following a game here, by the way. Bishop f8, we can simply move the bishop. Okay, again, kind of slow, preparing moves. One of the benefits, black can't do anything. There's no counterplay. It's very difficult for black to manufacture their necessary breaks here, which are b5 or d5 or f5 under good conditions because we have so much space and control. So bishop f1, we're afforded the ability to slightly improve our position with king h1, bishop f1, a3, but eventually the idea is clearly knight a4. We're going to put pressure on b6, we're going to put pressure on the queen side. They can't play queen a7 because knight b3, we're going to win this pawn anyways. Another typical idea, by the way, here is c5 to open up the queen side, because a lot of times we're better prepared on that side of the board than our opponent. The game continued with d5. They tried to open up the center, realizing that at some point they're going to have to, but this hangs a pawn, and it hangs a little bit more than that as well, right? So here they sacrifice a knight because essentially they're already in such a desperate situation. They're realizing that if they continue to wait around, I mean, we've just completely dropped a bomb on the queen side. We've taken a pawn, we've opened up lines for our pieces, we're going to just completely crush them if they do nothing. So black here, out of desperation, tried to swing over some pieces, but it was not enough, unfortunately, for them. And very quickly, white managed to play g3 and convert the position in very convincing style. So this is something that can definitely happen in your games. I mean, you're just playing natural moves in the beginning, developing, and then already you have this b4 idea, knight a4 idea, and you're putting pressure on these pawns that are very difficult for your opponent to defend. So remember, the key weaknesses here, b6 and d6. You can play for c5, you can move your knights around and use your bishops. Another key idea is playing queen e1 and queen f4, and this way targeting the d6 pawn. There's a plethora of ideas at your disposal, and I think a lot of the times you'll see that the play really does play itself for white here. Okay, So these were the systems where black does not play for the move e5, which again, I think they need to be playing for here. So what if they play e5? This is the critical try. We have to spend some time here. We're playing knight b3. And again, there's a branching point. They can play slow moves, bishop e7, bishop e6, a6, knight c6. Against all of these, we're playing c4, and we're actually transposing to the lines that we just saw, because let me just go back for a second to some of the lines that we were looking at here. One of the things to note is that in these positions, black can always play e5. It's not particularly good because it surrenders d5 and f5, and it renders the light squares in the center completely weak, but it's a possibility. And in the line that we just saw right now, where they go for the immediate e5, but then they do not follow that up correctly, and they play, for example, bishop e6, we're playing c4, and we're going to get the exact positions that we just saw right there. Knight c3, bishop e3, bishop e2 castles. This is essentially transposing, and if anything, the committal idea of playing e5 for black probably hurts them more than it helps them in this specific case. So what should they be doing? What is the correct approach? It's to follow up the move e5 with the move d5. Again, anything that they play aside from d5, we're playing c4 and we're establishing the Maroczy bind. There is one exception, one very tricky exception to keep in mind. They can play a5, and this is specifically designed to combat the move c4, because now there is a pretty spectacular tactic where the fact that they've played a5 means they can play a4 and the king takes away the square from the knight. No need to allow any of this. This is really bad for white, but against a5, just good to know, develop the knight first, and we're not getting c4, but it's okay because they've wasted some time, and this means that we've gotten essentially 2 knights out for the price of 1, and we have good control. The knight can jump in further, and if they go a4, no biggie, we move the knight to d2, it's coming to c4, and we can already put quite a lot of pressure on them. I have this actually with bishop e7, knight c4, bishop e6, bishop e3, they castle, and the knight comes to b6 and already causes some big damage. Rook a5 and queen d2 x-rays that rook, and there's some ideas in the future. So just keep in mind, a5, don't go c4, but instead just develop the knight. But okay, d5, this is the critical move. This is what you need to spend time studying as white and really as black if you want to be able to equalize against the Prins Sicilian. So d5 is on the board. What do we play? Bishop g5. We have to immediately put pressure on their one developed piece and therefore also put pressure on the center. There's 2 approaches here for white. For black, they can either push forward with a d4. This is their best option. This is the most critical. Or they can play bishop e6. This is the most common. So we're going to start with the best option, which is d4. We're going to play c3, immediately challenging the center that they have just created, and they have to defend it. So knight c6, and we're going to attack it once again. Now, in a lot of situations here, whether they play queen b6 or h6, what you're going to notice is that we're going to trade the bishops for the knight, so we're going to lose the bishop pair, but by doing so, we're going to remove the control that black has in the center, and therefore be able to win a pawn and blast open the center, and this will give us some compensation. So h6, for example, we're going to take, they give a check, knight c3, but eventually we're going to take the other knight, and we're going to be up a pawn in this resulting position. They have compensation because they have the bishops, and black has a fine game here, but they have to be precise. They have to play very strong, aggressive moves here. Otherwise, their compensation will quickly fizzle out, and if we can, for example, castle safely and then begin centralizing our rooks and getting our pieces into the game, things are not going to be looking too good for black. And so, for example, in this position, we are actually following a game that was played. White is totally fine here, and this move e5, in fact, already creates some threats, right? The pawn can potentially push forward and threaten to queen, and that's exactly what ended up happening a couple moves later. A nice sacrifice here. Okay, so we don't need to get into the specifics of the game, but just to show you, this is, of course, the idea. So the point that I'm making is that black, for a very small amount of time in this position, has 2 bishops in an open board and a king in the center to attack, but quickly we are going to castle, get our pieces in, and try to very quickly, again, stop them from being able to do anything immediate. And if they don't do anything immediate, and better yet, if they trade their bishops for one of the knights, then they really don't have much compensation for the pawn, and we're very happy in the resulting position. So again, a lot more to explore there. I mean, you could spend literally hours on this line with d4, but I think that's the general gist of the positions that result. We're going to give away our 2 bishops, but we're going to win a pawn, win the center, and try to essentially survive by castling and then play for more, in fact, with an extra pawn. So this is one of the options. The other option is bishop e6. This is more common. I've had this in several of my games, and what we play here is we take the knight, and then we're going to take the pawn here. And what we're going to go for is this endgame position here where we're castling. This is one of the critical positions that you should be familiar with if you're playing the Prins Sicilian, because it's super common. And here I find that white's play is just so much easier. And that is because white has many attacking ideas. We have a safer king, we have an open rook, we have a bishop that can come to c4 or b5, a knight that can come to c5, b5, or a5, another one that can come to b5 or d5, or even e4. And we have a lot of targets to attack, right? You'll notice this pawn is weak, the king is weak, the pawn here on f6 is weak. So the position is very good, I think, for white, at least from a practical standpoint. So I'll show some of the variations that can happen. Against the move knight c6, we're playing bishop b5, and we are immediately challenging this knight. Now, for example, the move a6, which is possible here, is actually not so strong because we can take and immediately hit f6, and then immediately hit c6 here, and then immediately hit a6 here, and we're winning back one of the pawns. Our knights are getting into the game. You can see just the pressure that we non-stop put on our opponent in these positions, and that is all because their king is in the center and their pieces and their pawns are very uncoordinated in this position. So this is one example. Now a6 admittedly is not the best move. Rook c8 is more common and better, but this gives us knight d5. And one of the nice things here is that we're hitting f6, and after f5 to defend, we have a draw at our disposal. This is assuming that they never want to give away the bishop, because this bishop is a key defender, and in fact now after rook e1 ideas, the entire center can collapse very quickly. So assuming that they're never going for this trade, we have a draw if we want it at our disposal. We don't have to play for the draw. In fact, we can, for example, continue bringing pieces into the board. We always have the draw at our back pocket, and having a draw, especially against a higher rated player so early on, is not a bad thing to have. So that was one line that I wanted to show with knight to c6. Now, the other way to develop the knight is through d7, and here I have a game that I want to show. Here we can use the b5 square, not for the bishop, but in fact for the knight, and then the knight can come to c7, and the knight can eventually jump to d5, and we're forcing them essentially, otherwise they would allow a lot of pressure on f6, so we're encouraging them to give away their bishop. But like I mentioned, parting ways with this bishop is often very risky for black, because then their entire center seems a lot less secure. So here bishop c4 comes to defend everything, and now we can already bring our rook to the center to e1, and you can see that our pieces are just quite simply better than our opponents. And this is, I think, very typical in the Prins Sicilian. Their king is in the center, which means it's a common target. g4 is super typical to freeze these pawns and render them weak for the remainder of the game. And we'll just look at how this game ended here. Eventually, we had this rook being trapped here along the 4th rank. It had to give itself up for the bishop, and eventually white ended up winning. In fact, black resigned here. So another game that I wanted to show, there's one final one that I'll end the video with, which is the move bishop h6 check here, which black can throw in whenever they want, but the ideas for white are essentially the same, whether the king's on c1 or b1. We're bringing our knights into the game, we're putting a lot of pressure, knight d5, we're encouraging them to trade, at which point you can just, again, sense how weak this king is, right? Look at how our pieces are getting into the game. There's so much pressure here, and it forces black into a state of complete passivity. Look at this position here. 3 pieces are attacking f7. They are forced to defend with all 3 pieces. And Yeah, I mean, this position is just totally crushing, right? We can push our pawns forward. Black is totally paralyzed. They have nothing good they can do. And eventually, white ended up breaking through here, which is bound to happen at some point when black is forced into such levels of passivity. And indeed, in fact, this one ended quite brutally. There is an unstoppable mate on h1, and black resigned. So I think that's a pretty symbolic way to end the exploration into the Prins. You can see some of the attacking and fun chances that we can get. Now, the final thing that I promised to look at in this video is how what we just learned applies to all of the other Sicilians, because I want to leave you with a little bit more than just a repertoire against one single type of Sicilian, which is d6. Admittedly, the main Sicilian sharing that name with knight c6, but nonetheless, just one variation that black can go for. Well, the beautiful thing about the Prins is that against a6 or e6, guess what? We can play c4, and we can get very similar structures, right? You can imagine if this trade happens, we have the Marozzi bind, and then it's a matter of simply putting the pieces in the same locations, and we're going to get essentially a transposition, right? A very similar thing happens against g6. We can first break in the center, and then play c4. And again, the same sort of structure for white and black will appear with bishop e3, bishop e2, queen d2, getting our rooks in the center, and the same attacking ideas primarily on the queen side are very much existing in this position as well. And this means that the only Sicilian that you're going to have to know to complement what you're learning with the Prins Sicilian is against knight c6, because unfortunately there is no satisfactory way for white to establish the Marozzi bind against knight c6. Playing c4 here is premature, and e5 specifically is a very solid refutation, and white totally loses their opening advantage because the position is closed. So the extra move that they have is useless, and we do not want to allow this. It would be amazing if we could somehow trade in the center and later play c4, sorry. You know, if they play a random move here, a6, maybe we can get away with it. But unfortunately, in the main Sicilians, instead of a6, they're playing, of course, for this early e5, and we're just not in time with playing f3 and c4. So you do have to know some stuff against knight c6, maybe the Rosolimo, maybe the open Sicilians with knight c6, but the Prins Sicilian can do a lot for you, and it can be a very powerful weapon against, I would say, a majority of the systems that you can see. Comment down below what you think of this system. If you'd like, I'm happy to make a far more deeper exploration into it, where we can kind of dissect all of the different lines that we talked about in a lot more deeper level. And I think this could be helpful, not only for you guys, but also for me, because I do enjoy playing the system myself, and that will force me to be a little bit more formal in my analysis of it. So let me know if that's something that you would find interesting. Otherwise, thank you for watching. Subscribe if you're new around here, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.